The wind howled like a wounded beast across the open plains, scouring the land with a merciless chill that cut through skin and bone alike. Snow whirled in the air, thick and unrelenting, blinding anyone who dared to look ahead for too long. Beneath that storm, stumbling through the knee-deep drifts, a small figure trudged forward with grim determination. Mei Lin wrapped her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fabric was soaked through and useless against the freezing gusts. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks raw and bleeding, and her breath came in shallow, wheezing gasps. Behind her, clinging to the hem of a tattered skate, were 2 children, her son, barely 7, and her daughter, 5. Their faces were ghostly pale, their eyes wide and frightened. They hadn't eaten properly in days. The girl coughed weakly, a sound that stabbed Mei Lin's heart like a knife. She turned briefly, forcing a small, trembling smile to reassure them, though inside she was terrified they wouldn't survive the night. Every step was agony. Her boots, long since worn through at the soles, let in the freezing slush. Her toes had gone numb hours ago, and she feared what that numbness meant. But she couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. Somewhere ahead, beyond the storm's veil, there was supposed to be a ranch. A white man's ranch, rumored to be prosperous and well-protected. She didn't know if the owner would hire her. She didn't even know if they would welcome her kind. But she had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. She had made a promise to her husband as he lay dying. She would keep their children alive, no matter what this harsh land threw at them. The memory struck her suddenly, vivid against the whiteout around her. His body had been crushed under a landslide while working on the railroad, one of hundreds of Chinese laborers whose names were never recorded, whose graves were unmarked. She had stood by helplessly, clutching her children, as the foreman muttered something about moving on, and the other workers silently gathered the dead. That night, under the cold stars, she had knelt by the makeshift grave and sworn to the silent earth that she would not let their children perish. Her tears had frozen on her cheeks. Now, months later, that vow was the only thing keeping her legs moving. The wind grew stronger, pushing her sideways. She almost fell, catching herself at the last second. Her son stumbled and she hauled him upright, whispering encouragement in Mandarin, the language of their lost home. His small hand was like ice in hers. The girl began to whimper, and Mei Lin's heart clenched. She knew they couldn't last much longer in this storm. Her mind was a blur of exhaustion, hunger, and terror, but one thought pierced through the fog. If she failed now, no one would even know their names. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape gradually emerged. At first she thought it was another mirage born of desperation, but as she drew closer, she saw the outline of a fence, and beyond it, the faint structure of buildings, a barn, perhaps, and a house with smoke curling weakly from its chimney. Relief and dread collided inside her. She had found the ranch. Now came the harder part. She half-dragged, half-carried the children through the gate and stumbled toward the house. Dogs began barking, sharp and alarmed. A man's voice shouted something indistinct. A figure emerged from a barn, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat. He held a lantern, and the light glowed against the snow like a beacon. She raised one hand in a feeble gesture, though she couldn't even feel her fingers anymore. The man strode toward her, suspicion etched across his face. Up close, she could see his beard was flecked with ice, his eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. 2 other men joined him, armed with rifles, their expressions colder than the wind. "What in God's name?" the bearded man muttered, stopping a few paces away. His gaze traveled from Mei Lin to her children and back. He recognized desperation when he saw it, but he also recognized trouble. She could almost hear the unspoken words, "Another mouth to feed, and not one of us." She opened her mouth to speak, but her jaw was stiff, her tongue sluggish. "Please," she managed to croak in halting English. "Work. I can work. Just children." She gestured weakly at her son and daughter, who huddled against her legs like frightened animals. One of the riflemen spat into the snow. "She's one of them railroad folk," he said with a sneer. "Ain't got no place here. Move along, woman." "She'll freeze out there," the lantern man replied flatly, but his tone carried no warmth, just fact. His eyes studied her with the wary calculation of someone who'd seen too many wanderers come and go. The other man laughed harshly. "Not my problem if she does." Mei Lin's body swayed as exhaustion nearly toppled her. She knew she had only one chance. Gathering the last of her strength, she met the lantern man's gaze. Her voice was rough but steady. "I ain't beautiful, sir," she said slowly, the words tasting strange in her mouth. "But I can cook. Work will feed my kids." She forced each syllable through numb lips, knowing that pride had no place here. She needed mercy, or at least pragmatism. The men exchanged looks. There was an awkward silence, broken only by the relentless wind. The bearded man, William Carter, though she didn't know his name yet, exhaled sharply through his nose. He wasn't a man given to charity, but he also wasn't the kind to let children die on his doorstep. "Get them inside," he finally said to the rifleman, "before they freeze solid." They grumbled but obeyed. She followed them into the house, nearly collapsing from the sudden change in temperature. The warmth hit her like a wall, making her dizzy. A woman inside, older, severe face, gave her a look of thinly veiled contempt but handed her a blanket for the children. Mei Lin huddled them close by the fire, rubbing their hands, whispering softly in Mandarin to soothe their trembling bodies. Gradually, color returned to their cheeks. William stood near the door, arms crossed, studying her as if she were a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. She was small, thinner than she should be, with eyes that held both exhaustion and an unyielding spark. He had seen women break on this land. He wondered if she would be one of them. "Where you headed?" he asked at last. She looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. "Hey," she said simply. "Work. Any work." "This ain't a charity," he warned. She nodded. "I know. I work. Cook. Clean. Anything." One of the riflemen snorted. "She'll last a week, if that." William ignored him. He wasn't sure why he hadn't turned her away yet. Maybe it was a way she'd spoken outside. Not begging, just stating a fact, offering what she had. Maybe it was a way her children clung to her but didn't cry, as if they'd learned early that the world had no patience for tears. Or maybe, though he wouldn't admit it aloud, it was because he recognized something familiar in her eyes. The land was harsh. It broke the weak. But sometimes it shaped the strong. "You can stay the night," he said finally. "We'll talk about work in the morning." She bowed her head slightly. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," he muttered. "Thank the storm. If it weren't blowing so bad, I'd have sent you on your way." She didn't respond. She simply held her children closer, feeling the fire's warmth seep slowly into their frozen limbs. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe without the knife edge of panic cutting through each inhale. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. She knew that, but tonight they had survived. Outside, the wind continued to rage against the walls, but inside the flickering light of the fire, Mei Lin's resolve hardened. She didn't need their pity. She needed a chance. And now, perhaps, she had one. As William Carter turned away, muttering orders to his men, she watched him with cautious hope. He was a stranger, a rancher in a land that had never been kind to her people. But he had not turned her away. That was something. She whispered a quiet prayer in her native tongue, not for miracles, but for strength. She would need it. The frontier had tested her before. It would test her again. But as she looked at her children's tired faces, she silently renewed the promise she had made on that cold, starry night beside her husband's grave. She would not let them die. Not here. Not now. Not ever. The morning after the storm, the land lay beneath a white shroud. The sky was pale and thin, like it had been bled of color, and the air carried the quiet sharpness that follows a night of chaos. Mei Lin rose before dawn, her body sore but her mind alert. Her children still slept wrapped in blankets near the hearth, their faces soft in the orange glow of dying embers. She pressed a kiss to their foreheads, adjusted the covers, and stepped into the biting cold outside. The snow crunched beneath her feet, echoing in the empty yard like a declaration that she would not hide indoors. She needed work. She needed to prove her worth. The ranch stirred slowly to life. Ranch hands emerged from bunk hoses, their breath rising in faint clouds as they set about clearing snow from paths, feeding livestock, and checking fences for damage. Their movements were practiced, efficient, but many paused to stare at the small Chinese woman moving among them. She was an unfamiliar presence, one that didn't quite belong in their world of rugged men and harsh wilderness. Mei Lin ignored their stays. She found the kitchen, its door creaking with age, and stepped inside. The space was cluttered, filled with the remnants of horrid meals, unpoured coffee, stale bread, unwashed pans. Without waiting for permission, she tied up her hair, rolled her sleeves, and set to work. Her hands moved with quiet precision, scrubbing, chopping, stirring. She had learned to cook not from books but from years of necessity, from watching her mother prepare meals in a crowded village kitchen, from feeding hungry laborers who worked until their bodies nearly broke. By the time the first men entered, rubbing their hands to shake off the cold, the smell of warm porridge and baked bread filled the air. They stopped short, sniffing the unfamiliar but inviting scent. William Carter appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable beneath his hat. His gaze swept over the orderly kitchen and the steaming pots. "You've been busy," he said gruffly. Mei Lin kept her eyes lowered. "Breakfast ready," she replied simply. He didn't praise her, but he didn't stop her either. That was enough. Over the next days, she carved a place for herself in the rhythm of the ranch. She cooked hearty meals that filled stomachs and lifted spirits, repaired torn clothes, and cleaned with an efficiency that left little room for complaint. Some of the men grumbled about her presence, muttering slays under their breath when they thought she couldn't hear, but she never responded. She had faced far worse than whispers. Her children began to adapt as well. Her son followed the ranch hands around, curious about their work, while her daughter spent hours watching chickens in the yard, her laughter ringing out like a fragile melody against the harsh backdrop of winter. William watched her from a distance, puzzled by her resilience. She did not demand gratitude. She did not complain. She simply worked, day after day, as if sheer effort could anchor her to this place. He admired that, though he would not admit it aloud. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire, he found her repairing a torn blanket by the light of the kitchen lantern. "You're not like most who come knocking," he said quietly. She looked up, confused by his sudden willingness to speak. "I cannot leave," she answered softly. "Hey, we can live. Maybe." He nodded once, then turned away without further comment. He understood that kind of determination. This land demanded everything from those who tried to tame it. Those who didn't give enough were swallowed whole. A week later, the first storm was followed by another, fiercer and more unpredictable. Black clouds rolled in like an advancing army, swallowing the afternoon light. The temperature plummeted. William barked orders to his men, sending them to secure the barns, bring the herds closer, and board up loose structures. Mei Lin hurried to gather her children, tucking them safely inside the main house with blankets and lanterns. But she didn't stay with them. She went back out into the storm, her shawl whipping behind her like a torn flag. The ranch needed every hand. The wind screamed as snow lashed the yard. Horses panicked in their enclosures, kicking and snorting. One fence collapsed under the weight of the wind, sending a few animals bolting toward the open fields. Mei Lin saw one of the younger men struggling to shut a gate against the gale. Without thinking, she rushed to help, grabbing the other end and pushing with all her strength. The gate slammed shut, the boy's eyes widening at the unexpected assistance. She said nothing, just moved on to the next task. William spotted her through the storm's haze. At first he was furious. She should have been inside, safe, but then he saw the determination in her stance, the way she threw herself into the work without hesitation, and something shifted inside him. She wasn't merely surviving here. She was fighting to belong. The storm raged through the night. When it finally relented, the ranch lay battered but intact. Several fences were down, and some livestock had perished, but it could have been worse. In the pale light of dawn, William gathered the exhausted workers by the barn. "We made it through," he said gruffly. "But this winter's just getting started. Keep your eyes sharp." As the men dispersed, one of them, a wiry, bitter fellow named Colton, threw a glare at Mei Lin. "Would have been better if she stayed out of the way," he muttered loudly. "Ain't right having her here." William's gaze snapped to him. "She pulled her weight," he said sharply, "more than some I could name." Colton flushed but didn't reply. Mei Lin lowered her eyes, pretending not to have heard, but inside, a small spark of gratitude warmed her chest. William's defense was brief and gruff, but it was the first time anyone had spoken for her since she'd arrived. Not long after, a new figure appeared on the ranch. Mei Lin first noticed him while hanging laundry behind the house. He stood at the edge of the tree line, tall and silent, watching with the stillness of a hunting animal. His clothes were made of buckskin, his long hair tied back, and his face bore the calm, unreadable expression of someone who belonged more to the wilderness than to any ranch. When he stepped forward, the children spotted him and froze. He raised a hand in a slow, non-threatening gesture. Mei Lin's heart pounded. She called the children to her side, uncertain whether to run or stand her ground. Before she could decide, a sharp cry split the air. Her son had wandered too close to a pile of firewood, where a rattlesnake had taken shelter from the cold. The snake struck, fast and silent. In a blur of motion, the stranger darted forward, seized a snake just behind its head, and flung it far into the field before crushing it with his boot. Mei Lin clutched her son, shaking with delayed terror. The man stood a few paces away, his calm never breaking, as if such dangers were everyday occurrences. William arrived moments later, rifle in hand. "Tor," he said, recognition softening his features. "Didn't expect to see you round here." The man gave a single nod. His eyes flicked to Mei Lin and her children, then back to William. They spoke briefly in low tones. Mei Lin couldn't catch the words, but from William's relaxed posture, she understood that Tor was no threat. Over the next days, Tor appeared sporadically, sometimes bringing meat from a successful hunt, sometimes helping repair damaged fences. He didn't speak much, but his presence was steady, watchful. At first, Mei Lin avoided him, unsure of his intentions. But her children were less cautious. Her daughter, fascinated by his quiet demeanor, began leaving small offerings, an apple, a piece of bread, on the fence post near where he often stood. He never took them in front of her, but by morning they were always gone. It became their silent ritual. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, a rumor spread among the ranch hands. A band of outlaws had been seen near the valley, raiding isolated homesteads. Supplies were scarce, tensions high. William tightened security, posting lookouts at night and instructing everyone to stay vigilant. Mei Lin felt the atmosphere change. Laughter grew rare. Conversations turned quiet, tense. She kept her children close, sensing danger creeping closer like a wolf at the edge of the firelight. One evening, while she mended clothes by lantern light, Tor entered silently, his expression grave. He spoke to William in short, clipped sentences. Though Mei Lin couldn't understand everything, she caught enough to know the bandits were near. William's jaw tightened. He began issuing orders, his voice carrying the weight of leadership forged by necessity. She watched him and realized something she hadn't before. Beneath his rough exterior, he carried the burden of every life on this ranch like an invisible yoke. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he rubbed his shoulder when he thought no one was looking. He was a man shaped by responsibility as much as by the land. That night, after her children were asleep, Mei Lin stood by the small window and gazed at the dark horizon. She thought of a village in China, of lantern festivals and laughter, of her husband's smile. Those memories felt like they belonged to another life. Here, the future was uncertain, shaped by storms, prejudice, and threats that lurked just beyond the fences. Yet, for the first time, she felt the faint stirrings of something fragile but real, a sense of belonging, not given, but earned. As the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, she whispered a promise to herself. She would not falter. She had weathered storms before, and she would weather what came next. She had no other choice. And somewhere out in the darkness, unseen but near, danger was moving closer, setting the stage for a trial that would demand more from her than she had ever given before. The night began in silence, the kind that settles just before something breaks. A brittle moon hung low over the plains, its pale light silvering the snow and stretching long shadows across the ranch. The air was so still that every creak of the wooden fences sounded like a warning. Mei Lin stood at the kitchen window, staring into the darkness as she cleaned the last of the supper dishes. Her children were asleep in the small corner room they had been given, their breaths soft and even. She should have been resting, but unease pricked at her senses. The ranch had been tense for days, every man on edge, rifles kept closer than usual. She remembered Tor's grim warning, the whispered talk of bandits moving through the valley. Tonight felt different, like the moment before a storm when the sky holds its breath. A sudden neigh shattered the quiet. Then another, more frantic. Mei Lin's heart slammed against her ribs as she dropped the dish and rushed to the door. The horses were spooked, their cries sharp and terrified. From the barn, someone shouted. Gunfire cracked through the night, short and violent. The stillness snapped, replaced by chaos. She bolted toward her children's room, scooping her daughter into her arms and grabbing her son's hand. "Stay close," she whispered, forcing calm into her voice though terror clawed at her throat. She guided them toward the root cellar beneath the house, shoving open the hatch with trembling hands. "Hide here. No matter what happens, stay quiet." Her son wanted to protest, but one look at her face silenced him. She lowered them into the cellar and closed the hatch just as another gunshot echoed, closer this time. Outside, flames erupted near the barn, orange tongues licking upward, casting wild shadows across the yard. Bandits swarmed the ranch like wolves in the night, their faces half hidden by scarves, their shouts mingling with the crackle of fire. William was already in the yard, barking orders, rifle in hand. Tor emerged from the tree line like a ghost, moving with silent efficiency, his bow flashing in the moonlight. Arrows found their targets with deadly precision, dropping 2 raiders before they reached the main house. Mei Lin froze for a heartbeat on the porch, watching the scene unfold. She was not a fighter. She was a widow, a cook, a mother, but this was her home now. If it fell, her children would have nowhere left to go. She ran back inside, grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth, and snatched a small knife from the table. Her hand shook, but her eyes hardened. She remembered the day her husband died, how helpless she had felt, how the world had decided her fate for her. She would not be that woman tonight. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cold night. One of the bandits broke off from the group, heading toward the house. He was young, barely older than her eldest son would have been in another life, but his eyes were cruel and desperate. He climbed the steps, expecting an easy target. Instead, Mei Lin swung the skillet with every ounce of strength she had. The blow caught him on the side of the head with a sickening thud, sending him sprawling into the snow. She grabbed his dropped pistol with shaking hands, the weight foreign but solid. Her breath came fast and sharp, fogging the air as she aimed toward the chaos in the yard. William noticed her and shouted something, but his words were lost in the raw gunfire. He was cornered near the barn by 2 attackers, his rifle empty. Before she could think, Mei Lin raised a pistol and fired. The shot rang out, startling even herself. One bandit jerked backward, clutching his shoulder. The other turned toward her, enraged. Tor appeared behind him like a shadow, dragging him down with swift, brutal efficiency. William stared at her for half a second, surprise flickering in his eyes. Then he nodded curtly and turned back to the fight. There was no time for words. The flames spread quickly, consuming the barn's dry wood. Horses screamed in panic, thrashing against their stalls. Without hesitation, Mei Lin sprinted toward the barn, covering her mouth against the smoke. The heat was intense, but she forced herself forward, untying the frightened animals one by one, slapping their flanks to send them running into the night. Her eyes watered, her throat burned, but she refused to stop. One mare balked at the door, too terrified to move. Mei Lin grabbed a rope, looped it around the animal's neck, and pulled with all her strength. A flaming beam crashed down behind them as they stumbled out into the open air, barely escaping before the roof caved in. Outside, the fight was turning uglier. The bandits had come prepared, their numbers greater than the ranch hand had expected. William fought like a man who understood exactly what was at stake: his land, his people, everything he'd built. Tor moved through the melee like the wind, silent and deadly, an arrow here, a knife there. But even their combined efforts were straining. Mei Lin saw one of the attackers creeping toward the house, toward the cellar where her children hid. A cold fury surged through her. She followed him silently, clutching the pistol with both hands. He never saw her coming. The gunshot echoed sharp and final, dropping him before he could lift the latch. Her hands trembled violently afterward, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. She turned back toward the fight. A sudden shout drew her attention. William staggered, blood blooming on his shoulder from a gunshot wound. He fell to one knee, struggling to reload. The bandit leader, a thick-set man with a scarred face, advanced on him with a rifle leveled at his chest. Time slowed. Mei Lin saw everything in sharp detail, the leader's finger tightening on the trigger, William's jaw clenched in defiance, the firelight glinting off the snow. She ran forward without thinking, screaming a wordless cry. Her body collided with the leader's arm just as he fired. The shot went wide. They grappled in the snow, his strength overwhelming Hayes, but she bit, kicked, and clawed like a wild animal. He slammed her against the ground, knocking the wind from her lungs. His knife flashed. Before he could bring it down, Tor's arrow struck him clean through the chest. He toppled sideways, dead before he hit the ground. William pushed himself upright, grimacing through the pain. He extended a hand to her, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. There was gratitude there, and something deeper, an acknowledgment of the courage he had shown. She grabbed his hand and helped him stand. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader fall, began to scatter into the night, pursued by ranch hands and Tor's unerring arrows. Gradually, the gunfire faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the laboured breathing of survivors. When the last of the attackers had fled, the ranch was left scarred but standing. The barn was gone, a smouldering ruin. Several men were injured, one fatally. Mei Lin walked among the wreckage in a daze, her body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. She found her children in the cellar, clutching each other in the dark. When she opened the hatch, they threw themselves into her arms, sobbing. She held them tightly, burying her face in their hair, whispering soothing words even as her own tears mingled with the soot on her cheeks. Dawn came slowly, washing the ranch in cold, pale light. The survivors gathered in the yard, surveying the damage. William stood with his arm bandaged, giving quiet orders for repairs. He moved stiffly but with unbroken resolve. Tor disappeared briefly into the woods, returning with fresh meat for the injured men. No one spoke of last night's terror directly, but it hung heavy in the air. Something fundamental had shifted. Mei Lin was no longer just a quiet widow who cooked their meals. She had fought, bled, and stood beside them. The ranch hands looked at her differently now, not all with warmth, but with respect earned the hard way. Later that morning, William approached her near the house. His face was drawn, exhaustion carving new lines around his eyes, but his voice was steady. "You saved lives last night," he said simply. "You've got grit, Mei Lin. This place, it's yours too, if you want it." Her throat tightened. She looked at her children playing nearby, their laughter fragile but real, and then back at him. Part of her wanted to accept the unspoken offer she heard beneath his words, a place, perhaps even companionship. But something inside her knew that her strength had been forged by standing alone when she had to. She shook her head gently. "I stay. Work. But I do not belong to anyone." William's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. "Fair enough," he said. "You've more than owned your place here." As the day wore on, the ranch began its slow, painful process of rebuilding. Ashes were cleared, fences repaired, animals rounded up. Life, as it always did on the frontier, moved forward with stubborn persistence. Mei Lin worked alongside the others, her muscles aching but her spirit steady. When night fell again, she stood outside, holding her children close, gazing at the stars. The air was cold, but the silence felt different now, not foreboding, but calm. She had faced the fire and come through the other side. Forgiveness came quietly, not as a grand gesture, but as a simple truth she carried in her heart. She forgave the land for its cruelty, the past for its losses, and herself for the moments of doubt that had nearly broken her. She was still standing. Her children were safe. And for now, that was enough. The frontier had tested her, and she had answered with strength she hadn't known she possessed. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its cry rising into the night. Mei Lin listened without fear. She had found her place, not through acceptance, but through resilience. And as the stars burned cold above her, she whispered a promise to the quiet plains. She would keep moving forward, no matter what storms came next.